In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, a letter we're quite sure Paul wrote, he takes some time in chapter 9 to share some of how he understands God's call on his life and how deeply committed he is to the work of sharing the gospel. In the passage I'm about to read this morning, we get a glimpse of how Paul goes about his work. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might, by all means, save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might share in its blessings. Here ends the readings from 1 Corinthians.
As the kids are leaving, I want to extrapolate and expound a little bit on the pragmatic potentiality. No, just kidding. Took me a long time to come up with that one. I would like to sort of beat it to death, you know. So a little while ago when Jim led the scripture lesson, he shared with us Paul's own words about what it meant to share the gospel, how he went about sharing the gospel. It's really interesting to have him talk about himself that way. The phrase that stuck out for me in that is, I have become all things to all people. I've become all things to all people. What does he mean when he says that? It's really some of what I want to talk about today, and I want to, for the Now Testament, show you a little film clip this week. The movie is a movie called The Emissary, a Biblical Epic, and it's a story of Paul. And in this particular little scene that we're going to see, you're going to hear him preaching in Athens. He made a short stop in Athens. He was invited to talk to a group of men. I will say much more about it in the actual sermon. But the words that you're going to hear with Paul speaking are pretty much verbatim, right out of the book of Acts, in which it's described his experience of preaching there. So we hear Paul preaching at the Areopagus there in Athens. And I think this little nugget may give you one example of what it looks like when Paul tries to be all things to all people.
Men of Athens, I see you are a very religious people. For as I was passing through your city, I noticed how many gods you worship. I even saw an altar to an unknown God. I want to tell you that this God you worship without knowing is the same God who made the world and everything in it. But since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he does not dwell in temples made by man, nor is he served with human hands, as if he needed anything. For he himself gives all men life and breath and everything. We should not think of God as an image of gold or silver or stone, made by man's design or skill. Now God commands all people, everywhere, to repent. For he has set a day when Jesus, the Christ, will judge the world. Now God has given us proof of this. And that after Jesus was crucified by the Romans, he raised him from the dead.
Did he say raised from the dead?
Whoever heard of such a thing?
Impossible. Gentlemen, be quiet, please. Be quiet. We are here to expand our thinkings. and listen to new truths. Paul, we appreciated what you have to say. You've given us much to think about.
I know the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks search for wisdom, but we teach Christ crucified and resurrected to life again. For these are stumbling blocks to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks.
Well, I regret that the hour has grown late. We will hear you again, Paul. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That is all for today.
Tell us more about this Jesus.
Yes, please. We want to believe.
Is he really alive?
Yes, I have seen him. He is alive. Alive.
So Paul's little stopover in Athens was pretty brief. And when he was there and in the heart of the city, he saw right away that it was a place filled with idols. And he knew also that Athens was a place that really relished the idea of free thinking and the exchange of all kinds of thoughts and wisdom. There were many, many rich people in Athens, and they loved nothing more than to debate and discuss philosophy, religion, the meaning of life. It's a huge part of Athenian culture. We know that in the city center, when Paul first went there to preach the first few times, there were all kinds of people gathered there. And Acts mentions two groups of people in particular, which I think are interesting. Acts tells us that there were Epicureans in the crowd. Epicureans are people who believed that the world, its passions, its pleasures, was what you lived for. The goal in life was to avoid pain and to embrace happiness in all the ways this life offered. And they thought all stuff of idols great foolishness. Also in the crowd, says the author of Acts, were Stoics. And Stoics had a very, very different view from those Epicureans. They believed that the value in life came when you controlled your emotions and controlled your passions, so that you lived in harmony with all things. And because of this, they saw very little difference between God and the natural world. So you can picture with those amongst the crowd, when they first heard Paul speaking somewhat like this, they found it a little bit confusing, and they were curious. And the scripture says, so they took him. Some of the crowd took him to speak at the Areopagus. The Areopagus, if you were looking at that picture, is sort of like a small stadium, a place where they might hold court, they might have judgments, a place where they would have more formal debates and conversations. It's hard to know for sure if them taking him to the Areopagus was a kind of compliment or a kind of complaint, because there were very strict laws in Athens that said you could not introduce a new god into the city unless it met with certain very careful specifications. Now, that sounds intriguing to us, but this is where Paul the pragmatic comes in. Practical Paul. Yes, practical is the word we are talking about. Pragmatic is the Latin root word for practical, down-to-earth, sensible, realistic. Pragmatic has little to do with what you're thinking or what you're feeling. It has to do with what you say and how you act in the world. It has to play out in real time and space. Sometimes pragmatism is called functional truth. Paul clearly sees this in his time here in Athens and in other stories. He sees that the best way to share the gospel is in some ways pragmatic. He's got to be practical. And quite often the practical thing to do, the behavior that's going to bring people into the love of God, is the one that simply meets them where they are. So, when he was in the heart of the city, he notices this altar to an unknown God. And when he's preaching and talking to these men at the Areopagus, he says, I saw that statue, that altar to an unknown God, and I want to tell you, I know this God. We have this in common. Now, this is really, really smart in a couple of ways. First of all, by talking about this God that's already established in Athens, this unknown God, well, Paul is then steering clear of introducing some new God into the Athenian world and consequently possibly breaking the law. But this attitude of talking about this unknown God and saying, I know this God, that also is building some common ground. Very important. I know your unknown God. All of this talk about the idols and the unknown God, it gives him a reason to compliment them. Oh, I see you are very religious because you have so many gods. Now, this is a little bit of a left-handed compliment, but it's nevertheless a way to say, I have really been looking. I see what the world around you is like. And I see in particular this unknown God. And then when he talks about that, it gives him a reason to speak about this unknown God as the creator of the natural world. And he quotes their own poets, the world in which you live and move and have your being. He says, that's this unknown God. The God I know created all of that. So he's appealing to those Stoics a little bit who embrace that natural world. But he also says, I also know that this unknown God cannot be contained by an altar or silver and gold images. This God is much greater than that. Idols, then, like the Epicureans say, are a kind of foolishness. The unknown God is greater than all of that. He's got their attention, their curiosity. He stirred things up a little bit, and some of them, as you saw in that little clip, actually do stick around and say, we would like to know more. We are truly curious. When Paul says he is all things to all people, he is not being fake or pretentious. That would be horrible. He is not selling out who he really is in order to win some people over. And he's not messing with the actual message of the good news. He's simply paying attention to who he is talking with, who is standing in front of him, and he's trying to meet them there. I can picture him asking himself in these situations, what kind of package should I put the gospel in here? What language should I be using? Where do I begin this story of Jesus? What is most needed here? And always as he answers these questions to himself, it's based on who he sees before him. This is wisdom. This is wisdom for us all this time later, not just because it's practical and useful and effective, all of which, frankly, is true. But this is wisdom because it knows that relationship is what matters most, because ultimately, that is where God lives. You hear me say this often in one form or another, that God is in our relationship. That's how God travels in the world. That's how love is spread, through loving connections. Paul is showing us how that looks. He's showing us what it's like to make even a little relationship a starting point of some kind. Now, Paul was a devout, practicing Jew. He was also a Roman citizen by birth. He presented himself as one or the other, or both, depending on what was most helpful and what was needed in the moment. He would speak and write with the authority of an apostle commissioned by Jesus Christ, the risen Lord himself. And then in the next breath, he would be speaking of the depth of his own sinfulness. He could speak as one totally free and turn around and offer himself as slave. And none of this was Paul being false. All of this was really Paul. All of this is how he could mix and match the stuff of who he is in ways that he could make connections to other people and somehow, in a moment, be something to the person standing in front of him. Well, we're complicated. We're multifaceted like that too. We are totally capable of finding common ground with most people who are around us for one reason or another and building even a tiny bit of relationship based on that, because only in relationship is where God is going to exist between us and in us and amongst us. This is a kind of never-ending process, frankly, this stuff of relationships getting deeper, new ones beginning. And if we cannot find that little place of common ground to start with, if it's not obvious when we are looking in front of us, then we get to create it. And we do this, I think, this is the riskier part, by simply honestly being ourselves. This requires us to be vulnerable in some way and see what happens. Now, I got to tell you, this happens in our world all the time, all around us, and we need to be clear that it's not always Christians who are doing the work of being vulnerable and showing themselves to see if there isn't a way to open up new doors and possibilities so that God can be at work. This past week, on Tuesday night, there was an interfaith prayer and reflection gathering. That was the anniversary of 9/11. Some amazing things happened that night, not the least of which was James and J.J. Rasmussen from our own church closing that shared time with a Native American dance and chant, and J.J. playing his beautiful flute. The theme of the night was healing. Now, I personally had put the order of service together for this event, so I thought I knew what to expect, and I thought I knew what would be happening. Turns out I didn't know. The first people to stand and speak were the Adewale family, and some of you might remember them because they were the Muslim family that came to us just about a year ago, and they read from the Quran and they shared with us as part of our forum that day. Beautiful family, young family. And they stood up to share, and Edom and Christina read from the Quran and translated, and then Edom spoke. He said, I can't be up here today and not speak a little bit about 9/11 and how it still breaks my heart after all this time that the God I love and worship and the God I understand as a God of peace could be used by people who call themselves Muslims to do so much harm in the world. And then he went on and he said, I have to tell you this year, this is particularly hard for me because now my oldest daughter is old enough to have questions and to try to understand what happened those years ago, because people are saying things to her and asking her questions, and I'm finding it very hard as a parent to have to explain to her that people used the name of Allah and the faith of Islam to do such harm in the world. He apologized for that yet again to the gathered group, that God could be used in such a way. Well, I got to tell you, you could hear a pin drop in the room. It was so beautiful. We all understood at some level either what it's like to be a kid trying to figure stuff like that out, or what it's like to be a parent trying to help a child along in that way in a very complicated world. He was simply vulnerable, and he opened up to us, and our hearts were completely opened to him. God was present in that moment of relationship. Well, then, a little later on in the evening, a young Mormon man stood up to speak. I thought it was amazing enough, frankly, that a Mormon would be part of our interfaith time. But he stood up. His name was Leroy Fiscus. He's a young guy. He had recently graduated college, and he was sharing with us about a small but significant movement within the Mormon church to reach out to gay and lesbian people with love, seeking forgiveness for the way they have been treated by the Latter-day Saints, asking them to forgive. Wow, did not see that coming. And then he said, are there any gay and lesbian people here with us today? And two people came up and stood with him. He invited them to come up, and he asked them to forgive him on behalf of the Mormon church. And he said they could speak for a moment, and both of them were eloquent and brief, and it was lovely. They felt a little hope in that moment. And then he asked us all to pray with him. And when Mormons pray, they cross their arms and they kneel. And this young man kneeled in front of all of us with these two people up there and prayed. Then when he stood up, it was the sweetest thing. He said, okay, seriously, if a Mormon man can stand here at an interfaith service between two lesbians, there is hope for this world. And it was true. And I got to tell you, he built some bridges. He tore down some walls. He found some common ground and provided some hope and healing that I didn't see coming in that room. God was absolutely present in his openness and his desire to be in relationship. Now, it isn't always about talking. Some of us like to talk more than others, this is true. But it is 100% about showing up with your eyes open and your heart open, seeing, hearing, and experiencing who's in front of you. You open your eyes, you open your heart, not to mention that you open your mind, and sometimes you open your wallet. That's our job. Our job is not to judge, which unfortunately is what Christians have become famous for. Our job is a much more practical one. Our job is one we can actually do. To be ourselves, as Paul showed, in such a way that we may be able to be all things to all people. So when we are out in the world, we can ask the question, what is needed here? That's our prayer. That is our prayer. Oh God, what is needed here in this moment? Oh God, what is needed here in this moment from me?